Hey there, beautiful souls. Welcome to Beyond the Surface, where the saying to be seen is to be understood comes to life. I want to begin by first honouring the traditional custodians of the land we live and work on. I live and work on Gundungurra land and acknowledge the traditional landowners of my guests near and far. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the memories, the traditions and cultures of our First Nations peoples. The land below my feet is, was and always will be Aboriginal land. I am no stranger to the profound journey of pain, grief, anger and heartbreak that often accompanies the loss of church, community, faith and the unwinding of our core beliefs. In the midst of this labyrinth, I found healing in the stories shared by others who have walked a similar path. Each tale, unique in its own right, weaves an invisible thread of connection, uniting us through the tapestry of religious trauma and healing. Here, in the warmth of these digital walls, I want you to feel at home. This is a haven where your memories are not just acknowledged, but deeply seen and believed. So kick back, relax, and let's embark on a journey where your story is not just heard, but embraced. Welcome to a community where storytelling is a powerful force. This is Beyond the Surface. Welcome, Angela. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk today.
I'm so excited. You are in Indiana, is that right?
I am, which is the middle of the coldest place on the world right now. It's not, but it feels like it. So, Mama's ready for spring, which is just right around the
Yeah.
corner, but it's slow coming this year.
Yeah, absolutely. And here I am going, I had to turn the fan off behind me because of the noise
Yeah.
for the recording. And so we're over here in Australia sweating, and you're like, bring on spring. Um,
That's awesome.
the wonder of people being on opposite sides of the world, right?
Yeah.
Now is Indiana part of the Bible Belt technically?
Oh, heck yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay, I thought so.
So for listeners who are familiar with US politics, Mike Pence is from Indiana.
Oh, yikes.
So we are definitely conservative land.
Right.
Yeah, for those who are older, Dan Quayle also came from Indiana, but that's okay if
Okay.
nobody knows who that is.
I
He was
I
a
don't know who that is, but I do know Mike Pence, and
Yeah.
I, on behalf of everybody who does know Mike Pence, I'm sorry that he's from Indiana.
I know there's so many wonderful things about this part of the country, but
Yeah.
it is really deeply steeped in
Right.
very conservative, even fundamentalist
Yeah.
Christianity, which is hard because um yeah, we just have a lot to offer as far as the region goes, but we have some cults here, some fundamentalist
Mm,
cults and some pretty unfair policies and
yeah.
legislation and stuff. So it's
Oh,
unfortunate.
yeah, absolutely. Whenever I talk to I spoke to Tim Whitaker in one of these
Mhm.
recordings as well, and I was like, man, the US is like a shit show over there with like religion and
Yeah.
politics, and it's just
Yeah.
like all interconnected, and yeah,
Yeah. We're really, I think, as a country, really struggling to come to terms with how
yeah,
unhealthy our political system is and our religious system is and how much overlap there is. Because
yeah,
there's a long history and a real deep level of exploitation
yeah,
within Christianity. And I think if it benefits you, of
yeah,
course you don't see
of
it,
course,
right?
yeah,
Of course you don't see it. If the system is designed to favor you over others, then it's working.
yeah.
Why would you ever sense that something is wrong? And so
Yeah,
um
absolutely.
there are some beautiful pockets of people who have
Mm,
done the work of reckoning that history, but unfortunately it's not the majority yet, which you can see from our election history.
yes,
So
yes.
Yeah, so next year's going to be rough during the election year. Like
Oh,
the next,
yeah.
like this whole year, and then next year we'll have a bit of an election year hangover. But we're just
Mm,
doing and impacting in small ways wherever we can because it's a ginormous system that is
yeah.
really reluctant to change right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so where does your story start?
It's kind of a hodgepodge.
Okay, I love that.
So, yeah, so everybody always says, when did you grow up in church? How did you
Yeah.
get here? And I grew up around church. I
Okay.
didn't necessarily grow up in church on a regular basis. So I was the kid that would go to the week-long vacation Bible studies. I was the
Mhm.
kid who would go stay at grandma's house for Easter. My grandparents were all very religious, always in church, just wonder, especially your grandmothers, very, very wonderful, strong spiritual women in this, kind of strong spiritual space.
Yeah.
Um, but my parents and I, we moved around a lot. And so it's not like I had a home church. I would just go to VBS wherever. And
Mm,
but so I kind of grew up around church, which there's pros and cons there because, sometimes you get the real surfacey best parts, but then sometimes you also get the real surfacey like sin and brokenness parts. So
yeah.
it was a very interesting thing. And then just like we were talking about here in the Midwest, you don't have to ever step inside a church building to get a hefty dose of conservative Christian ethics and politics and culture because it's everywhere.
Yeah.
It's everywhere, right? There are a few bigger, more urban communities that I would say there are pockets that aren't like that. But as a whole, our state is pretty rooted in that kind of conservative Christian belief system. So that's where I started. I went to church for a little bit in high school, kind of went away from it, really came back to faith when I was I don't know, late 20s, and
Okay.
had a gaggle of kids and had an unsuccessful marriage and got remarried. And my husband and I both kind of had the same story of popping in and out of church our whole lives. And so
Mm,
we found a church and we settled in and we went all in.
right.
And there were so many beautiful things that happened there, so many wonderful friends that we made, so much that we learned. But the longer we were there, the more the cracks started to show, especially when we got
Mhm.
into leadership and got to see some of the behind the scenes conversations. And so we left there a little, just a lot discouraged about some of the judgmental behavior and arguing about things that didn't seem like they mattered, like the color of the carpet and just dumb
Oh,
things.
wow. Right.
Yeah, it's kind of an urban legend in the US that older people who've been in church for a long time will argue about modernizing the church and like a lot of churches they have this green or this red carpet. I don't know who sold it, but somebody sold a lot of it in like the 70s and the 80s. And so it's kind of this urban legend that people will get into arguments over changing the color of the carpet, but it literally happened. I was in a conversation where I
Oh,
saw
my
it happen and I
goodness.
was like, looking at my husband like, why is this important even? Who cares? Like,
Oh, my
right?
goodness.
So like I said, there was a lot of really beautiful things that happened there, and they were
Mm,
really that community really was kind of where I cut my teeth in grown up religion and faith. So we left there a little disconcerted, went to the exact opposite. We went to an independent church that was kind of in our downtown area. And I say downtown loosely because it's still a rural community. I think our city has like 35,000 people. So
right.
there are colleges in Indiana that are bigger than my whole
Oh,
town.
wow. Okay.
So yeah, some of the Big Ten schools have like 40, 50, 60,000 people, and
Yeah.
that's like our whole county. So
Yeah.
we went to a different church. Because we really thought that what we were seeing was because of that one church. At
Mm,
that point, we didn't have any sense that this was a systemic issue, right? That the unhealthiness, the
mm,
toxicity that was kind of undermining some of those beautiful things was normal. We should know
yeah.
that. So we went to this other church and dove right in and got into leadership real quick. And within about, oh gosh, I think it was only like 8 or 9 months it happened again. That
Oh,
it was like there was just some really bad things that were happening. Again, people we loved, location we loved, all kinds of stuff we loved. but it was very clear that we weren't staying there. And
Yeah.
so after all these years, I was running an online ministry and was really wrestling with a lot of doubts and questions. And we sort of stumbled into a church that a friend of ours recommended, a friend of my husband's, who's still a great friend of the family, grew up in that church. And he's like, here's what I know. You know, they've had some problems in the past. They're doing pretty well now. Like there was a scandal back 20 years ago or something like that, right? So he kind of gave us the lowdown. And I remember on the way to church that first time telling my husband, like, if this doesn't work, this is it. I'm done.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if I meant I was done with church or if I was done with faith or I was done with God, but I was just hanging on by a fingernail, like not
Mm,
even all the fingernails, just one little pinky
yeah.
nail. Um, and we got into a really good place. And you know, at this point, I can see that there are some flaws, like there are in most churches, but it was really a place that was safe for me. Now, with privilege as a white hetero cis woman, I'm saying it was safe for me.
Yeah.
Um, and there were a lot of really amazing people who poured into us and allowed us to really bounce back and do some deep healing from that trauma. And
Mm,
so we've been members there for a long time, haven't attended in a while, but it's still what we consider our home church. Our kids are still, some of our kids are still involved there. They're old enough that it's their choice, right?
yeah.
Um, and it's still, you know, those leaders are who I would call if there was an emergency. You know, if we were in the ER at 2 o'clock in the morning with one of our family members, they would be there. They would
Yeah.
absolutely be there. So it's kind of a long and winding road. And I'm in this really it's not really unique, but it's a little weird when you think about traditional Christianity to have a home church and also have taken a step back
Yeah.
and really leaned into the online community. It's a good fit for now. Who knows where I'll land or where my kids will land, or, you know, I don't have a crystal ball to predict that, but
Mm.
that's sort of the relatively short version of my long and winding road. Yeah. It's
Uh,
hard to encapsulate that because it
oh,
is.
of course.
Yeah, and there's a lot of nuance, and I hate to leave out that nuance because I know so many other people have long and winding roads. Like, you know, we all have these stories, and I think being able to hear someone who has a similar story,
Yeah.
it's just encouraging, right? It just
Yeah.
reinforces that whatever has happened to us, we're not the only one.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that I think is sort of the core as to why I even started this podcast was, you know, to that saying to be seen is to be understood.
Yeah,
And to hear even just, like stories may be so glaringly different, but there might be themes and emotions and experiences that are still really similar, even in
yeah.
different faiths, different nations.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, to be able to hear somebody else's story is not only a privilege, but an opportunity to sort of almost reassure and validate yourself in your own story
Right.
and experiences. Um,
Exactly. And I think there's also some magical things that can happen
yeah.
when you see someone else's story that's similar to yours and are able to call out strengths and to call
Mm,
out moments that you're really proud of them in those. And then you go home and you're like, well, crap, that happened to me. I did the same thing.
yeah,
Maybe I should be proud of myself too, right? Like, so it, you know,
absolutely.
not just validating the experiences that we know that we have, but
Mm,
sometimes calling out these strengths and these vulnerabilities that we can't see in
mm,
ourselves.
yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
If we jump back to those first two churches for a minute, what were
Yeah.
some of the things that um, you were wrestling with? Was it doctrine?
Yeah.
Was it people's behavior? What was it?
You know, in the first church, it was kind of low level, all the things, right?
Okay.
So it wasn't an affirming church.
Mm,
And I was really wrestling with that
yeah.
because there was something in my heart that said that we should be affirming.
Mm,
But then there was also this fear of like, I don't want to go out and say that and lead a bunch of people down a wrong path, right? And so that's something I was wrestling with. And there were others that were kind of wrestling with it too. So we were able to have some private conversations that
mm,
probably wouldn't have flown well if we were in a bigger setting.
yeah.
Um, the other one of the other things that was there were two other things that were really problematic for me. There was a large the children's ministry was exploding in a great way with lots of families. And so the church decided to build this very large addition and really expand, like radically expand the amount of space for children, put in a small second kitchen, and just do a whole lot of things that would really make it a more functional space in the long run. And one of the things that really landed wrong for me was there was a decision made by the committee to build an elevator shaft, but not put an elevator in, which would make the second floor youth area accessible.
Right.
And we actually had parents who were in power wheelchairs, which you can't just like, get out of them and carry them up the stairs. They weigh hundreds of pounds. And I think that um, I was in the disability space at that time. I worked as a supported living nurse and worked with infants and toddlers with disabilities. And I remember thinking, how is this even possible? I mean, the Special Olympics team uses this church all the time for their gatherings and their events and everything. What are we communicating? Like,
Yeah.
we're going to put all of the children's ministry and youth and teen and everything on the second floor, which means that no one with any mobility issues at all can get up there.
Yeah.
So that was something that was really problematic. And then the third thing that happened was there's a preschool there, and one of the teacher's assistants was pregnant and wasn't married. And my husband was on the board at the time, and they were having conversations about whether or not they should fire her.
Oh,
And I just, there's just so many things where you're like, what are we actually living out, and what are we
yeah.
communicating?
Yeah.
What are we prioritizing? And so yeah, there was just there was a lot of that was happening. And then when we switched to the second church, even though there were some wonderful people trying to lead and doing a decent job of leading, the infrastructure was just not there.
Mm,
And so there were some unethical things happening within the leadership team. And they were discovered, and things happened, and it was all personal stuff, not my story to share.
mm,
But yeah, it was just like, how is this happening here too? Right? Like, how is this space so unhealthy? And at that time, that was an affirming church, so that wasn't really an issue. It's my understanding it's not an affirming church anymore. Different
mm.
leadership and kind of shifted. But yeah, I mean, there was just this undercurrent of like, yay, I'm here. I know how to fit in. I know what the rules are. And then when I start knowing the rules, I'm like, well, wait a second. Would how would you respond to me if I showed up here 10 years ago when I was a single mom, or when I was a divorced mom, right?
Mm.
All these different things. And I think that I think I would have been welcome as a divorced mom. I think I probably would have been welcomed as a single mom, or as a single pregnant woman. But I don't know that I would have been welcomed in the same way, right? I
Yeah.
would have been welcomed as someone who really needs intervention and support, which I did, um, but not in that white saviorism way. That's really,
Yeah.
yeah, that's really a thing. So yeah, I put a couple of things about that in my book. I try really hard not to tell other people's stories. So
Yeah.
um, yeah, it was just this real wobbly sense of like, something's off,
Mm.
and people are getting hurt. People are
Yeah.
getting caught in the middle of these debates and these unhealthy doctrines. And that's not really where I want my kids to grow up. And it's definitely not where I want to grow up. It's
Yeah.
not where I want to spiritually
Yeah.
grow up. So yeah,
Absolutely.
lots of grief in both situations. And it was really hard to leave. The first church, we had been established there for probably, I don't know, maybe more than 5 years.
Yeah.
And I had two babies while we were there, and
Mm.
they were there when my daughter was very sick right after she was born, and she almost died. And we had the pastor drove an hour and a half to see us in the hospital the next day, and some of the other moms came down, and it just like they really held us in a lot of ways. And I
Mm.
think the hardest thing for me was realizing that not everyone was able to get that level of support and acceptance.
Yeah.
And that just didn't seem right. There was something in me that was like, maybe that's not right.
Mm. It's hard to sit with that nuance of joy and ickiness is the only word that's sort of coming to mind though, right? Because
Yeah,
for a lot of people it's very rarely all bad. There are
absolutely.
moments of joy and you know peace and love, but
Hmm.
it's like there's this giant shadow that overthrows that, where we go,
Yeah.
oh, but you just look at it so differently once you see that shadow, right?
Yeah. And I think I was talking with my friend Scott from the Chapel Probation podcast yesterday, and we were having the same discussion is that
Mm,
the more that you're marginalized, the more that you are pushed to the margins of the church or by the church, the easier it is to say, okay, this is unhealthy, I'm walking away. But the
mm,
closer you are to the center, the more like, or if you think about like a hierarchy, the closer you are to the top of that food chain, the top of that pyramid, the
mm,
harder it is to see what's happening, the harder it is to reconcile that, yeah, there's maybe a little bit of harm coming to me, but there's a
mm,
lot of harm that I'm passing on to others. And the harder it is to say, time out, we need to do something here. Like
yeah,
either stay in and fight or take a step back. But just staying silent, like I did for so many years when I was trying to figure out if it was okay, like did God
mm,
actually affirm consensual adult same-sex relationships?
mm,
Like now it's a hell yeah. But
yeah,
in that time where I didn't have an answer and I just kind of stayed quiet while I was trying to figure it out, in some essence, that was me using my privilege to
mm,
not confront that issue.
yeah,
I mean, my husband and I had conversations about it. He was already convinced that it was okay and that
mm,
it wasn't just like something we should tolerate. But I
mm,
really wrestled, like, what do I do in my ministry? What do I say? So I just avoided it,
yeah,
right? Which shows how much power I had in the system to just be able
yeah.
to sit back and not make a stance, not make a decision.
It's also hard though, I think, and I say this as a queer woman, that even if you did have that hell yeah moment, I guess
Hmm.
there's a twofold thing is that, you're not just having a debate with one person or a conversation, you're navigating, raising that within a system that,
Right,
and like a deeply rooted system that has oppressed the queer community for decades.
yeah,
Um, and the flip side is, whilst, you might be a white heterosexual woman, you are still a woman. And
right,
women are not
exactly.
always listened to that
Yeah,
would be different to if your husband was having that conversation, it would be received
right,
very differently. And so your privilege, yes, but also like
right.
the environment is not, I mean, we talk about church environments not really being one for questions or rocking the boat anyway. You sort of go with
Hmm.
the tide or you're out.
Right. And I did a lot of research around that during my master's program because I
Yeah.
was looking at, Gen X women, which is me.
Mm,
How much opportunity is there for mentorship and leadership? And,
mm,
am I being mentored as a leader? Is there opportunity for me to grow into leadership positions within the church? And I knew there was a little bit of an issue, but when I started talking to people who were very high up, in
mm,
denominations that affirmed women as preachers. And they were saying, yeah, I still get left out of conversations. I still find out about meetings afterwards, even though I'm higher up than many of the people who were invited to those meetings who were male,
mm,
right? And so I work with a lot of women in my deconstruction coaching, and so many white women um, come to me and start with like, okay, now it's impacting me and I didn't see it before. And they
mm.
just start pulling that one string and it all unravels. And so it's kind of that human nature thing of like, until it impacts me, it's really hard to see the impact of some of these
Mm.
negative things. And I wish we could get away from that, but I just think that's how we're wired,
Yeah.
right? Like it's just how we're wired. So I think we're seeing a large a large reckoning because the misogyny has gotten so loud.
Mm.
It's all over our political platforms. It's in Hollywood. There's lots of different things that are happening. And there's a lot of white women who are finally coming to terms with the idea that, yeah, this harms us, but
Mm.
it also is part of what marginalizes queer people and people of color and
Yeah.
indigenous people.
Yeah.
And it has for centuries.
Yeah.
And so there's this reckoning that's happening. And I'll be really interesting to like, if I could travel forward in time, like 100 years, and see what this moment creates, I think it'll be
Mm.
really interesting because it feels like there's a level of momentum that's greater than there has been in recent history. But
Yeah.
also, there's a massive amount of power that's being held by people who don't want to see the system change.
Yeah.
So, it's 50-50. Like, which way are things going to go?
Yeah.
We just saw a huge split with United Methodist Church. I don't know if you've been following that at all or not,
Oh.
but they have been working on, for decades, it's my understanding, trying to decide if the church should actually officially be affirming. And it
Right.
came to a head because there are Methodist churches that are affirming, and that not just affirming in that tolerating, like, come in and let's convert you sort of way, right?
Yeah.
But like actually affirming.
Yeah.
So, having a same-sex relationship or being queer or being bi, however whatever label you wear,
Mm.
that doesn't even keep you out of being a preacher, right? And so actually an equitable environment. So some churches were like that and some weren't. And so what
Mhm.
we saw is this debate kind of heightening each time they would meet. And there is actually a large faction of the United Methodist Church who did not want to become an affirming denomination and did not want individual churches to be able to make that decision,
Wow.
that disaffiliated. So that's happening. I mean, we're literally living in a time of schism
Yeah.
in one of the biggest denominations here in our country. And so, like, where I'm at, all of the Methodist churches disaffiliated. So
Mm.
I think, in a year or two, we'll start to see the impact of that. But again, like 50, 100 years down the road, we could actually be living in a moment where massive change is happening and it sticks and it lasts. Which is why these podcasts and these books and these conversations are so important,
Yeah.
because it's exhausting. And
Absolutely.
there are days where there's not much in the tank. And so
Yeah.
we have to keep in mind what's at stake. And we also have to keep in mind that this is a long game. It's not
Mm.
going to be something that, we can't all deconstruct this year and then next year everything's cool. Like,
No.
it's not how
Yeah.
it works.
Yeah. I
We'll
mean, I
move on to
wish
the
it
next
was.
resource. I know, right? Like, I was telling
Oh,
somebody earlier, like, I love that I have this book. I'm so excited to get it in people's
yeah.
hands. And also, wouldn't it be cool if we didn't need it?
I
Like,
know.
if nobody needed a deconstruction coach because we all had it figured out and everybody
Yeah.
was safe and all of our spaces were equitable, wouldn't
Mm.
that be cool? But we're
Yeah.
not there. We're not even
No.
remotely there.
No, not even close.
Unfortunately, we're
Um,
not.
yeah. How did navigating all of those different questions and the church politics and all of that, how
Mhm.
did that impact your personal faith?
It was challenging. And I would say I probably vacillated between being really angry about it and also kind of being dismissive of, like, oh, that's just that group of people, right? And so there was some humbling that had to happen for
Mm.
me to realize that it actually was the entire belief system was facilitating some of these bad actions, and reinforcing a lot of this negative stuff that was doing real harm. So that
Mm.
was kind of a humbling experience, and I grew so much in that first church. I really did. Like, I really, really grew so much, and then had to rewrite some of it.
Mm.
I'm still rewriting some of it, right? And I'm lucky that I'm, like I said, I'm a white hetero cis woman who's married with children in the Midwest. I have a master's degree from seminary, so I'm educated. Like, I have a shit ton of privilege when it comes to this society. So
Mm.
there's space for me to unravel some of those things. And there's a lot less pressure to do so than people who are being further marginalized because I hold a place of privilege. So
Yeah.
there's always this like tug of war happening between um, how do I change my beliefs? How do I get healthier as an individual? And how do I rest enough that I can be in this systemic battle long term? Because you
Mhm.
can't just go all day, all the time in either of those spaces, right? There's got to be a balance and there's got to be
Yeah.
some nuance and some sharing to it.
Yeah.
Um, so I would say that's the biggest way
Mm.
that I've been transformed. I don't believe in absolutes as much as I used to. Um, which you'll love this being therapist. Part of my PTSD, my trauma response is to look for absolutes because then I know exactly what's going on.
Yeah.
So being kind of a type A person, having a history of trauma, being an Enneagram 8, like I want justice, I want rules, I want to know
Mm.
where things stand. And I still love to color outside the lines, but you got to tell me where the lines are first.
I
Which
love
is
that. I
there's
love
so
that.
much hypocrisy in that, right? Like it's so like, oh yeah, I'm gonna color
Oh,
lines, but just enough that you don't reject me.
yes. Yeah.
So that's had to change.
I will. I mean, I think anybody who has been in any sort of organized religion struggles with trying to fit things into a binary black or white sort of
Yeah.
scenario and having to start to go, oh, maybe there's I always go to say 50 shades of grey, but it's probably
Right.
really inappropriate.
Hey, you're just coloring a little bit outside the
Yeah,
lines. It's fine.
there's so many different colors between black and white.
Yeah,
And but all of those colors take a little bit of wrestling with,
absolutely.
because
Yeah.
they're outside of what you are used to. And I think, you always want that level of certainty that,
Mhm.
that I guess faith and organized religion brings you.
Yeah.
I tend to be the same. I will joke with my therapist that, like, I'll go with the flow, but what time does the flow start? Like,
Right. And
yeah,
where are we going
that's
to end
me.
up? And when do
Yeah,
we get to stop for snacks? And who's going to
exactly.
be in it?
Yeah.
Right.
When are the
Exactly.
toilet breaks?
Totally
Like,
get
when
it.
are all of
Yeah.
those things? And then
Yeah.
happy to go with the flow. Um,
Right.
so
Right. But you check with me if you're going to change anything because, that might
absolutely.
throw me a little bit. I think
Yeah.
that's the biggest gift of deconstruction for me is learning how to loosen my grip on things. And, um, you know, again, related to my trauma, so much hypervigilance. Like my brain
Mm,
had said, if we can see bad stuff coming quickly enough, we can get out of the way and we can protect the ones we love. Well,
yeah.
you can do that for a little while. But
Yep.
like I was way
Mm,
overextended. And a couple of the stories that I tell in the book were literally me just like, okay, I can't do it anymore.
yeah.
Like I just there's just not enough gas in the tank. It's not working anymore.
Mm,
And I think a lot of people experience that with COVID too, right? Like it's just one more layer of pressure and now we're working from home and we don't have the connections we normally have and then there's the added stress of kids being home and not being able to school like and then there's all this tension and so I think there's a lot of people especially women especially moms or dads that are really the primary caregiver in the home who've realized that that doesn't work anymore.
mm,
That works for a short term, but it doesn't work for the long term. And so there's this, I think, new awareness just about trauma and how it impacts us in the day to day, which pairs nicely with deconstruction because a lot of us
mm.
are trying to untangle from that religious trauma, even if we didn't know it was there.
Yeah, absolutely. And most
Mhm.
of the time, I mean, religious trauma is a relatively new concept and statement. Like the language around that is fairly new. It's very new in Australia. There are
Mhm.
very few of us who work in this space. And being able to have language around that makes a huge difference.
It does.
It gives you
Yeah.
understanding. When did you start using the language of deconstruction?
Somebody asked me that the other day, and I was trying to think back. I think it's probably been within the last 5 years, maybe 6 years. We've been doing the work for a lot longer, but it was prior was prior to 2020, but not by a lot.
Yeah.
So it's kind of hard to pin down. I'm not really sure what pushed it into everybody's language.
Mm.
But I remember when I heard it, I was like, what's this? Oh my gosh, that's what I've been doing for a decade, right? Like you're just like, oh, and that's what my coaching clients say a lot too. They're like, I don't even know if I'm in deconstruction. And then by the second or third session, they're like, oh yeah, that's what I've been doing. Yeah, that's me.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'll post something and they'll be like, yeah, I'm in that comment and I don't like it. Like, great.
Mm.
Now we know where you're at. Let's start from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, deconstructing starts a whole lot earlier than when you start to use the language, right? Like it,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of times people will say, when I talk about choice as a life
Mm.
coach, I thoroughly believe that choice is a big freaking deal, right?
Yep.
We can't always choose our circumstances, but we can choose how we respond in
Mm.
most cases. I'm not going to say always, but in most cases. And in those cases where we can't choose how we're responding, a lot of times we can choose later how we recover from those.
Yeah.
And so I'll talk about choosing deconstruction, and people are like, whoa, 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 I didn't choose this. And I'm
Mm.
like, okay, but at some point you woke up and said, I'm going to keep going.
Mm.
Whereas a lot of people will kind of wake up to a doubt or an uncertainty, or they'll read about racism, or they'll read about, the tremendous risk to Black trans women
Mm.
who are in religious cultures, right? They'll read something like that and maybe they believe it, maybe they feel a little sad, but it stops there, right? So we may not choose those early stages, but at some point there is a choice of like, yeah, what I've been doing isn't working. What else
Mm.
is there? And so that is where I think a lot of times people start using the word deconstruction, even though they've probably been doing it for a very long time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, the language of choice is one of those funny things that even I will talk to my clients about, that we make choices all the time, all day,
Yeah.
every day. We are making decisions, whether we are conscious of them or not. Uh,
Right.
so it's just about, once we are conscious of the decisions that we have been making, that tends
Hmm.
to be when that language starts, I find as well, whether it's
Yeah.
untangling or deconstruction or whatever that language was. Um,
Yeah. And I
what was
think
it
that
like?
just,
No.
sorry, just to piggyback off that,
Yeah.
I think that part of the reason religious trauma is so devastating is because we are taught that choice equals blame and responsibility.
Mm.
And so, especially when someone has been through abuse and gaslighting, and I mean, there's a million documentaries that are out right now where you can see how abuse really just completely undermines autonomy and sense of self, right? When we hear choice, a lot of times we think, I chose that, so it's my fault if it went badly.
Yeah.
And so I think even, the language of choice, that's
Mm.
why it's scary. Because
Yeah.
people are like, well, I didn't choose deconstruction, because the subconscious says, well, if you chose it, then all this misery is your fault.
Mm.
Right? It's just like an abusive relationship. If
Mm.
you were my abuser and I'm feeling awful and I'm being harmed, you might gaslight me into believing it's my own fault.
Yeah.
If I just tried harder, if I was a better spouse or whatever the case may be, right? And that's really the beginning work when we start deconstructing, when I work with clients in a group or an individual setting, we have to get into like, how do you feel about choice? How do you
Mm.
feel about yourself?
Yeah.
Like we'll get to the Bible verses later,
Yeah.
but it's not a logic head issue. It's how we've been shaped by this environment that we've been in, and which parts of that do we not want anymore. So it's a
Yeah.
behavioral situation rather than a knowledge situation.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I think whenever there is a spiritual aspect, trying to logic your way out of it is setting yourself up for failure, essentially.
Yeah.
You can't.
And also, we can talk about this because you're totally in the same space. So, for those who are listening who don't know about fight, flight, freeze, the whole
Mm.
amygdala hijack, basically we call it bear mode at my house because the other way to say it is
Ah,
too freaking long, right?
yeah.
So if you're hiking in the woods and you see a bear, your entire body is like, oh, hell, we're not going to be dinner. We're just not, right? So non-essential functions slow way down, and essential functions that are going to help you survive get all of the energy. They get all the juice, the oxygen, all the things, right? One of the things you really have trouble accessing is your logic brain,
Yeah.
because who cares if you can do physics and chemistry? You're getting away from a bear. Your
Yeah.
reproductive system shuts down because you're not making babies because you're about to get eaten by that bear if you slow
Mm.
down, right? And so think about that context for just a minute when we're talking about religious abuse, we're talking about trauma. Um, Toxic religious systems are designed to teach you that you can think your way out of whatever situation you're in, while simultaneously triggering your fight flight response where you can't access your logic brain.
Yeah.
Right? It's like telling a child they can ride the bike to school, but then you put the bike way up high in the attic where they can't get to it.
Yeah.
And then the kid's like, oh my gosh, I should be totally capable of this.
Mm.
No, you
Yeah.
shouldn't be totally capable of it, because you're being threatened in a way that your body is responding to this urgent crisis,
Mm.
but you've been taught not to trust any part of your body except the ones you can't access right now. It's
Mm-hmm.
maddening. It's like,
Yeah.
ah, but it
Yeah.
works really well in all cults. You don't even have to watch a
Absolutely.
Christian cult show. If you're feeling really if you're really struggling with kind of understanding how your Christian environment did this,
Mm.
go watch a cult about something else. Like,
Yeah.
go watch a cult about what is it? The Nexium that was
Oh,
like network
yes.
marketing, or the one about the dating. I can't think of what it. Oh, something about twin flames.
Oh, twin
There's not a
flames.
lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's not a lot of religion in that, but it's the same
Yeah.
programming. And sometimes getting out of the religious context and watching those other shows or listening to those stories, you can
Mm.
be like, oh yeah, I can see how that worked in my life too.
Yeah. Concepts and programming are the same, just different situations.
Absolutely.
It's the same, often this is just a quick bite comment, but often they'll talk about the North Korean War to
Mm-hmm.
describe all of the tactics that are used in coercive control for domestic abuse. And so, like completely different scenarios, same programming, same tactics,
Absolutely.
same tools. And
Yeah.
so that often, oh, I'm not in a cult, I'm in a church. Same tactics, same programs,
Right.
same tools. So,
Right.
yeah.
And it's
Um,
because they work. They work
yeah,
with how humans are
absolutely.
wired. I mean,
Yeah.
this is the same thing that happened. If you look at if you look at what Germany did when
Yeah.
it really moved into this hard anti-Semitic space prior
Mhm.
to Hitler coming to power, same exact thing,
Yeah.
same exact thing. If you go back and you look at like the witch trials of the,
Mm,
I think 14th, 15th, 16th century, like it's the same thing. You
mm,
look at the Inquisition. If you look at all of these different things, the Crusades, like any time that a system can push these buttons, they're going to get more power.
yeah.
The system is going to get more power, which means the people who are top of the food chain get more power. And so I
Mm,
think that's really where we're at. We're here in the States, at least, we're in a situation where there's a lot of people who are really tightly holding on to that power. Um, there's a lot of churches,
mm,
but there's also a lot of political leaders. Unfortunately, um, Trump was a litmus test to see how to exploit people.
yeah.
And, Cambridge Analytica figured out the math and
Mm,
figured out the algorithms and played on people's fears. And we're still seeing that um, it's still expanding, but we're just starting to see the impact of it. And it's not a good impact at all.
yeah. I think, we obviously religion is not as steeply rooted in our political landscape.
Mm-hmm.
But around ironically, around the same time as Trump, we also had the Australian version in Scott Morrison, who was basically best friends with Brian Houston, and
Mhm.
very like charismatic or evangelical, you guys would
Yeah.
call it, and you saw that in the way that he navigated his role as prime minister. And
Yeah.
he is no longer prime minister, but you are still seeing the impact that that had on the community and in the way that people talk about queer people, or the way that people talk about sexual abuse, or, whatever it is, you see
Yeah.
that rolling out into different facets of community. Um, what was it like deconstructing? You have 5 kids, right?
I do have 5 kids.
Oh my
Yeah.
goodness. Okay,
Yeah.
so let's bring it back to the home. Let's stop talking about politics for a second.
I know
What
it is.
what was
Yeah.
it like deconstructing with 5 kids?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because my two older boys are significantly older. My oldest is almost 30 and my youngest just turned 15. So we have quite a pretty wide range, right? And so the older two boys didn't initially grow up in church. They were
Mm,
with us when we went to that first church, right? Um, whereas the younger three had grown up in church,
yeah.
and we just had some really honest conversations. I mean, the best thing I've ever done as a parent was make a really hard shift, like a hard left turn,
Mm,
um, into how transparent and how honest I was with my kids,
yeah.
and how much therapy I got to manage my own shit, so I wasn't dumping it out on my kids. Because I
Mm,
didn't do a great job of that for the first 10, 15 years. I don't know. Forever is what it seems like. But I think we're in a place where my husband and I both understand, like, what are private conversations that happen between the two of us, or between me and my therapist, or me and a client, or whatever, and what are the conversations we have as a family. And
mm,
we're definitely having a lot of conversations with our kids that nobody ever had with us.
yeah.
And I don't think it was malicious. I don't think people withheld information from us. It
Mm,
was just, generationally, being steeped in this culture, there's a lot that people weren't exposed to, our
yeah.
parents, our grandparents, and so on, right? So I see a lot of healing going on, and I see a lot of shifting. Like I mentioned before we start talking, our um there's just there's so much that has shifted in the last 4 or 5 years,
Mm,
around COVID and having the kids home, and just being able to talk about racism in different ways,
yeah.
being able to go outside of my own bias and be able to bring that into conversations with our kiddos. And so it's not the way I would it's not the way I would recommend it. Like, sure, if you could get your whole life figured out before you had kids, cool. And also, if everybody does that, the species is going to die out, because
Yeah.
we never really get everything figured out. So I think I have a blog post about this, but I think the key is to be honest
Mm,
and to be transparent in a way that's age appropriate. So
yes.
what I tell my 15-year-old is obviously different than if she was 3,
Mm,
right? The other thing that's challenging is if one parent is deconstructing and the other isn't. I've
mm,
had some clients who are married to pastors, and pastors in really conservative, borderline fundamentalist churches, and that's hard,
yeah.
because, like, we can make our own decisions for us, but co-parenting is really challenging. And so,
Mm,
whatever situation you're in, give yourself time to
mm,
figure things out, and also be really careful not to beat yourself up in a way that undermines the work that you're doing,
mm,
right? There's a lot of there's just a lot of beauty in saying I did the best that I could with what I had.
yeah.
Um, and there, it's a lot easier to forgive parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, spiritual leaders, whatever, who taught us awful things, but that's all they knew.
Mm,
If we can say, I did the best that I had. I did the best with what I had. They did the best with what they had. And
mm,
also grieve the fact that they didn't have better,
yeah.
right? So that doesn't mean you have to keep exposing yourself to those unhealthy relationships if they are unhealthy. Um, but, like, anger is important, rage is important. If you try to live in your rage forever, it's going to eat you alive.
Yeah,
Like if the
absolutely.
only thing that's keeping you going is your rage, you're
Yeah.
going to crash, right?
Hmm.
So being able to offer some forgiveness to people, even if they don't deserve it,
Yeah.
really helps heal all those layers and those generations. And I think when we're raising our kids, that is a beautiful skill to teach them.
Mm.
Yes, have healthy boundaries and also recognize that even if a person never makes amends, you can heal some of the parts of you that they harmed intentionally or unintentionally.
Yeah.
Um, you can care for those tender spaces in a way that you can go on no matter what the other person chooses to do.
Yeah. I have what I call rage days.
Yeah. Oh, I love
Oh,
that.
yeah, where I basically am in the mindset where I just want to like burn it all down. But the reality is that if I stay there, I get burnt
Hmm.
too, right? So
Right.
you
Right.
can't live there. Like it's okay to have those moments and those days where you do just want to take a match to just like literally burn the system down.
Right.
But you can't live there. That's not a livable space. It doesn't make
Right.
your anger or your rage or the bitterness any less valid. It just means you can't stay there. We've got to do something with it.
Yeah.
And that's like, my therapist speakers, we have to do something with that emotion because otherwise, like you said, it will eat you alive.
It
Um,
will just eat you alive. Yeah, it's
yeah,
exhausting. And the stuff that's walled off, I think, is really scary for people to
yeah,
tap into. A lot of the coaching clients that I have are leaders. They're pastors or they're spiritual directors or they're heads of nonprofits. And so there's this kind of dance that they have to do of, I'm still serving people every freaking day
mm,
and just trying to hold it together.
yeah,
And so, going in and accessing those deep wounds requires a lot of vulnerability.
yeah.
So how do you move through the world and care for others and be able to release that rage and to go into those deep seasons of grief? One of the most
Mm.
transformational things I ever heard, I wish I knew who said it. It probably was Brene Brown. I don't know. It was somebody who said that anger is a secondary emotion. And I was like, well, wait, what?
Yeah, the anger
What?
iceberg. Yeah,
Yeah, so anger is a secondary emotion. And so even
yeah.
just saying I'm really mad, and that's okay. It doesn't need to go away, but what's underneath it? Like
Hmm.
what not just like what am I mad about, but like what other emotions is the rage protecting me from experiencing,
Yeah.
right? If rage is a shield,
Mm,
what happens if I lower that shield?
mm,
Is it grief? Is it
yeah,
isolation? Is it abandonment? Because for a lot
yeah.
of us, it is abandonment, right? It goes all the way back to um, attachment theory.
Mm,
And many of us are attached to the church. And I don't just mean like we go there and that's our community, but actual like child development
emotional.
attachment.
Yeah,
Right. And so
absolutely.
that's what regulates us is how the church, how church people in the church as a system approves of us.
Mm,
So when we start coloring outside the lines and we start saying, hey, I think you're grading me on the wrong scale, we have to detach from that system that's raised us
mm,
and learn how to attach to ourselves and to our own feelings. And a lot of times rage is protecting us,
yeah,
right?
absolutely.
It's not that it's necessarily easier to access. And again, I'm speaking as a white woman. Um, for many of us, it's more acceptable in low levels, right?
Yeah,
Now, if you're
absolutely.
talking about people of color, particularly
Yeah,
Black
no,
men do not have society's permission to even think about being angry. So
no.
again, this isn't one size fits all, right? But whatever emotion is coming to the surface, there's
Mm,
probably a whole lot of others attached to it.
yeah,
And learning how to get into those as a parent and talk about how messy they are and just be like, I'm feeling this. I don't really know what it is,
mm,
but I'll tell you later. Or one of the first things I had to do when I was really struggling to self-regulate because I was working through a lot of the trauma and doing a lot of therapy is I made a point of telling my kids when I was off and that it wasn't their fault.
Yeah.
Because as a child, we assume everything is our fault because that's just where we're at developmentally. So being able to go to my teenage, tweenage kids and just say, um, I'm really cranky today. I don't know
Mm,
what it's about, but I am not mad at you. I'm not disappointed with you. I just feel like shit today.
mm,
Like, or there were times where I'd have to miss activities because I did not have the bandwidth. Like,
yeah.
I was literally in my room under a weighted blanket, probably chewing on some ice or doing some other sensory thing, watching a murdery show on Netflix. Like, I don't
Yeah.
know why that works for my body, but it does, right? Because as long as they catch the person in the end, I feel this strange sense of like, okay, the
Justice
world
was
catches the bad guys.
served.
I'm safe, right? And
Yeah.
and I would have to say, like, when I would feel those moments coming on and there was a swim meet or a cross country or an awards, I would tell my kids ahead of time and say, I really want to go to this. Um, However, I'm not sure what I will have left. So if I don't go, please know that it's because of how I'm feeling, not because I'm not proud of you.
Mm.
And even now, as I say that, I start to tear up a little bit because I wish every parent had those words.
Yeah,
You know, I
absolutely.
wish every parent had those words because then at least our kids know
Mm,
it's not their fault. Even if they don't know what's going on and it feels totally unsafe, at
mm.
least they're not shouldering it. And that's one of those phrases I wish I had had from day one as a parent that I didn't.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, that was a huge answer about parenting, but it's give yourself permission for it to be messy because it's going to. The more you try to control it, the messier, the harder it's going to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you've mentioned it a couple of times. You have a book out, which
I
is
do.
Deconstructing Without Losing Yourself, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
I mean, and that little byproduct at the end is the important bit without losing yourself, because
right.
often I find with religious trauma, I will often even just describe in my own story
Mm-hmm.
that moment where I felt like the world was crashing around me was the moment where I felt like I lost everything that made me me. And so it's
Yeah,
about like you don't just lose church, you don't just lose community, you don't just lose a job or whatever it is that you
yeah,
physically lose, but you lose a part of your identity as well.
yeah,
And so navigating that deconstruction without losing who you are, or maybe it's about finding who you are as well,
yeah, exactly.
is
Yeah.
so important. So, what was it like for you to not lose yourself while deconstructing?
Yeah, it's so interesting because I think that culture and specifically religious culture
Mm,
teaches us that our identity is so wrapped up in all of those things
yeah.
because we're moving towards holiness. It's a sanctification thing, right? So if your identity is in your faith, if your identity is in Christ, if your identity is in your church community, whatever, then that's a good thing,
Mm,
right? But what happens is we almost dissociate from who we actually are. And for those of us who've never been outside of this kind of unhealthy religious environment, we never had a chance to form a good sense of self. I don't mean good, bad, but like a healthy sense of self,
yeah.
right? So you're right when you talk about losing yourself and finding yourself for the first time, right? Like you almost have to lose who you thought you were.
Mm,
You almost have to let go of who you thought you were to be able to figure out who you actually are.
mm,
And again, a lot of that goes back to the teachings about like you're evil, like humans are bad, like I can't even think of all the churchy words right now, but that's fine. Like you're innately bad. All right.
yeah.
Yes, we have this amazing creator who is all these wonderful things and compassionate and loving, but created these pieces of shit who will be deviants our whole life if left to our own accord.
Mm.
Huh?
Yeah. I
Like,
mean,
huh?
I think it's Dr. Hilary McBride says that spiritual trauma will always have been there as long as we've been told we were broken from the start.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
that's what is at the essence of, I mean, they talk about the gospel as being good news, but the essence of that is that you're really, really, really shit.
Yeah. At least the way it's been packaged, right? Who knows
Yeah.
what it actually looked like
Yeah.
in ancient history, right? The way that it's been in positioned
Mm.
is really puritanical. And I
Mm.
think that's part of the reason we have so many problems here in the States, because we come from that puritanical and very ego-driven, but still deeply colonial
Yeah.
mindset, right? Like we think we're at the top of the food chain, and also we think that we're the victims and we could do no harm.
Mm.
Like it's just ridiculous. But
Yeah.
the key about, without losing yourself is, even if you don't actually know who you are,
Mm.
you're in here somewhere, right? Like you exist. Just because you
Yeah.
can't see you, you exist.
Mm.
And there's one chapter in the book where I'm telling a story from a retreat that I was on, um, where the very last session we were talking about, it was almost time to go home, and we had been fostering at that time, and our foster kiddo was going back to her parents, which, you'd think is an amazing thing. But for several months, we had been told that that was highly unlikely. So
Mm.
emotionally, we were preparing for adoption. We were preparing for permanent placement and all of that. And while it is wonderful that her parents were able to kind of tick some boxes and get healthy enough for her to come home, I was struggling. I was
Yeah.
struggling. And so the concept that came out of that is like, I know how to fiercely fight for everybody, everything that's important to me, but I don't know how to fiercely release. And even though I was talking about her at the time, it broke something open in me, because it gave words, so important. It gave words to why it was so hard to let some of these labels and some of
Mm.
these celebrated attributes go. Like, I work hard all the time and I take care of everybody, and that's an amazing thing. Well, no, that's actually exploitation, right? That's me being exploited.
Yeah.
And so learning to fiercely release who you've been taught to be by an unhealthy system then makes room to look around and figure out who you actually are. And
Mm.
and for deconstruction specifically, I want, if people don't get anything else but this, I want people to understand that deconstruction isn't just saying my beliefs are unhealthy and looking around and finding a different belief system and jumping into that. That's conversion, right? And it might be a slightly less toxic system than what you came out of, but that's not the same as actually deconstructing and fiercely releasing all the things you think are true, and sifting and sorting and saying, okay, what's actually true here? And being comfortable with making those decisions yourself, instead of having someone handing you the this denomination for dummies manual, and all you have to do is go through and do the worksheets and check off the list. And
Yeah.
that's terrifying, but that is what true deconstruction is.
Mm.
um and I think that's why it's so transformational. Yeah, we're learning to attach to ourselves and have this
Mm.
beautiful healthy attachment with ourselves, rather than who we think we should be or what we think we should be doing.
Mm.
And you're really reparenting, even if you don't have children. Like, doing this process is reparenting ourselves and mothering ourselves kind of from the archetypal nurturing mother, not like the gender mother or the
Yes.
stereotypical Christian mother, right? Not what's been co-opted, but like
Mm.
this beautiful ability of this mothering soul to find healing, to
Mm.
heal ourselves.
Yeah.
um that is where the magic is. That's where the true deep healing happens. It's not from reading somebody's blog or watching a documentary about whatever topic has brought you here. Like, you've got to do that deep work first,
Mm.
and that's foundational to then being able to understand other people's stories and experiences, and make decisions about them from a whole healthy place, rather than the fear of picking the wrong thing and getting hit by a lightning bolt. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, you've already started sort of answering what I have been finishing all of these episodes with, but I'm sure you've got so many wonderful little tidbits in that book of yours.
Yeah.
My final question to everybody has been, what would you say to somebody who is fresh in their deconstruction?
First thing I would say is take a deep breath. You're going to be
Mm.
okay. Like, take a deep breath, get back into your body,
Mm.
and trust that where you are right now is not the only place you will ever be.
Mm.
Um, because I think that moment kind of feels like bottoming out, right? Like, it's like when someone is when someone has addiction issues and they realize that, yeah, they are actually addicted to whatever substance, right? Or whatever experience. There's a bottoming out of like, oh my God, I'm not who I thought I was. Um, and that happens in deconstruction. And I just, it can feel really isolating and really hopeless. And it can feel like you're the worst human being in the world. Why can't you just blah, 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 right? Don't try to beat yourself back into submission.
Mm.
Because if that worked, you never would have started deconstructing anyway.
Yeah.
Right? Like
Yeah.
you wouldn't have
And
gotten here.
none of us would be. Yeah. If
Right.
submission worked, we would all still be in the churches we were in.
Absolutely. So, you know, be kind to yourself, be patient to yourself. And then the second piece of that is get around some healthy people who are also doing deconstruction. Like I said earlier, rage is important and there is a place for rage. But if the only deconstruction voices you're listening to spend most of their time in rage,
Mm.
it's going to be really hard to move past it. So I call them the screamers, right? Even the screamers that you agree with, there comes a point where you have to turn that down and listen to the other voices, mostly your own voice.
Mm.
Listen to what your body is saying needs nurtured, right? Listen to your inner child as they grieve something that they didn't get because toxic religion took it away, right?
Mm.
So take a deep breath, recognize where you're at is not where you're always going to be, and then find some healthy voices that are talking about deconstruction that aren't pressuring you to adopt certain things. Like that's one of the reasons I created my Facebook group, because there are a lot of really good deconstruction spaces out there that are like laser focused on justice, and like they're
Mm.
very much in that angry space, and that's okay, but
Yeah.
it can't be, that's not where you live forever.
Mm.
And so I try to create a space where, yeah, there's room to be mad, but there's also room to laugh at David Hayward, the naked pastor's
Oh,
funny memes about sex, right? Like
yes.
there's room for that too. And there's room to
Yeah.
celebrate and to ask anonymous questions and be like, oh my gosh, this has come up in my sex life and I think it's purity culture. What do you guys do? Without having to like stand up on the internet and say who they are, right? So try to
Yeah.
find a space like that offers you some nurturing and isn't quite as agitating to the nervous system, because it's going to be hard to calm your nervous system anyway.
Yeah.
So just like there's enough that's going to get you in bear mode.
Mm.
Create some space for yourself where you're not in bear mode and
Yeah.
just give it time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's a really good point about the Facebook groups. I'm in a few, including yours, the Faith Deconstruction Cafe, which is
Yeah.
wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
And it is a very it's a different atmosphere because I'm in a few different ones and they all serve a purpose, but you need to know what purpose they're serving you. So if I'm in my
Right.
rage day, I know what group to go to where I can
Exactly.
filter and I can get that out and
Yeah.
and I can go, what is wrong with this freaking world? Like
Right.
there's those moments. But you need to know what purpose they're serving, because if they're
Right.
serving all the time, then you live there. And so
Right.
diversify your
Yep.
what your the input, diversify the input that you're
Absolutely.
taking in.
Yeah. And as you diversify the input, don't be afraid to put a healthy boundary in. When you see
Yes.
that communities allow or even encourage sometimes um, it to be real personal. So
Mm.
instead of raging about, how unfair our legal system is to people of color, I'm attacking an individual. And again, there are people who deserve that.
Mhm.
There are people who've died in the last 5 years that,
Yeah.
it's real hard to celebrate anything they did in their life, right? But
Yeah.
again, you can't live there. And so when we put all of the blame for something horrible on one individual, we really we really take the accountability away from the system,
Mm.
because it was just one person's choices. Again, coming back
Yeah.
to choice. But that's not the case. So
Mm.
yes, be really mad at that person for that abusive thing they did,
Mm.
and also shift your focus to how the system enables that to happen.
Mm.
Um, and then when you've got other people who are in conversations and in conflict, notice if the conversation stays focused on a topic or if it goes right to people. Like
Mm.
if you're in a group and somebody is talking to someone in conflict who has a different opinion and starts talking about you're stupid, you're a heretic, I can't believe it, especially if they're using ableist language and talking about you
Yes.
crazy or using the R word or just all these other derogatory things,
Mm.
that's not a safe space. Even if
Mm.
you agree with the person's position, if that's allowed for the long term, that's not a
Mm.
safe space. And so it's
Yeah.
going to be real hard to keep your nervous system settled in that kind of space. So
Yeah.
be picky, like please.
Mm.
And if my group's not a good fit for you, cool. No
I don't
harm,
know.
no
Yeah.
foul. Like I'm not going to feel bad.
Mm.
Find the space that you need and be real quick to shut the door on spaces that are doing harm to you in this moment, even if everybody else says they're amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Widen your lens. I feel like
Yeah.
that's like summarizes that diversify and
Mm-hmm.
and not be so, I mean, they talk very, I mean, I am used to hearing, find the narrow path. Let's talk about the wide path
Yeah.
and the wide lens and all of those different analogies.
Yeah.
But yeah, I like take a deep breath. I think that's a really good way to,
Yeah, just start there. And if that's
yeah,
all you can do
just,
today, cool. Do
hmm
that. Right? Like
absolutely. Yeah.
find your crunchy eyes, find a Netflix show that works for you,
Yeah.
and just take a couple deep breaths and then give yourself a high five for doing it.
Yeah,
Cool. You did something
absolutely.
for you.
Yeah.
Great.
I
That's worth
love that.
celebrating.
Yeah, because there is a lot of pressure to do it all and do it all really quickly. So I think that's really
Right.
great. Just come back, just take a deep breath and have a nap
Mhm.
if that's what you need.
Exactly. Whenever I go into coaching workshops, I always tell people, even if they're virtual, like bring a snack,
Mm,
bring something that's hot, bring something that's cold, bring a blanket if you have
yeah.
oils or a candle, bring a couple of those because
Mm,
your senses can sometimes anchor you in really beautiful ways.
yeah,
And you just never know what's going to come up. When you're doing this kind of
absolutely.
work, you just never know what's going to come up. And so trying to provide supportive environments for ourselves is something that very few of us were ever taught to do.
Mm,
And so it's just there's a learning curve and it's going to be awesome. You're going to figure it out, but it's going to feel really clunky and weird right now. And that's okay.
yeah, absolutely. Okay, before we wrap up, give us a nice
Yeah.
plug for your book, please.
Yeah. So the book is called Deconstructing Your Faith Without Losing Yourself. Erdman's published it in February. Really excited about it. You can find all the details on angelajharrington.com, and that's HERRINGTON. You can also find a link to the cafe that we were just talking about. And then there's a whole bunch of blog posts. There's one about parenting. There's one about how to survive the holidays and how to
Mm,
set healthy boundaries, how to know if you're in a toxic religious community, like all kinds of stuff on there. But that's the best way to find me. And then there's also some links to, of course, like Amazon, Barnes and Nobles. There's also a link on the book page to find independent bookstores in your area.
mm,
So, yeah, we all love the convenience of like the big box stores and Amazon, but also if you can support your mom and pop bookstore, please
yes,
do. You can also take the information off of Amazon and take it into your library and say, hey, can you guys order this for me? So
yes,
yeah, it's do whatever you need to do to get the book in your hands and let me know on the website or in the cafe if there's any way that I can support you.
yeah. And I will have all of those links in the show notes as well, so people can just click away.
Awesome.
And
Click
I
away.
will try and have a few links also in terms of being able to access the book in Australia. I think
Yes.
you would be able to with Amazon, but I will do some digging and
Yeah.
have some links there for some other bookstores in Australia as well.
That would be wonderful. And if it's not, tell me and we will get the
Yes.
publishers on it. They are amazing. We
Yeah.
will figure out a way to get it down there. If I have to jump on a plane and bring a suitcase, I will do that. I'll probably be
She's
able to bring my daughter too.
yeah, she's not kidding. She has friends in Adelaide now.
I do. I have friends in Adelaide.
Yeah,
Kit Kennedy
exactly.
is a friend of mine in the deconstruction space,
Yeah.
and we've been talking for years. It'd be great to see face to face. So
Yeah.
yeah, we'll figure out a way. We'll get it
Amazing.
down there one way or the other.
Oh, well, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, it's been a blast. This has been so much fun. I love safe spaces like this. So thank you for creating such a beautiful space for conversations where we can talk about all the good stuff and all the dumb stuff and everything in between.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for listening to Beyond the Surface. Until next time, take care, stay true to who you are, and remember, your voice and your story matters, always.